Welcome to Building Healthy Relationships, the 4 Habits podcast, helping you enjoy better harmony at home, thrive at work, and win at life. Here are your hosts, Dr. Andrea and Jon Taylor-Cummings, recognized authorities on the subjects of improving work relationships and cultures, as well as couple and home relationships.
Well, hello and a warm welcome to the next in the series of our podcasts. Hello, good morning, good evening, whatever the time is, wherever you're listening in. We're delighted today to have with us a very special guest, very special to us, been a real champion of the work that we're doing, and of course, a huge champion of marriage and family matters across the nation and across the world. Please help us give a warm welcome to Sir Paul Coleridge. Paul, it's wonderful to have you with us.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I mean, quite apart from the fact we've all worked together in the past, it's a fabulous thing that you're doing.
Well, we're really looking forward to the conversation. And as we like to say, we need to give you the proper introduction so that people understand the caliber of person that we're speaking with today.
You will see just how special he is when we say special. You'll see what we mean. So Sir Paul Coleridge is a former High Court judge in the UK and is acclaimed as a long-time champion of marriage and interpersonal relationships. He currently serves as chairman of Marriage Foundation, an organization that he founded in 2012, so 12 years now, to address the societal epidemic of declining marriage rates and skyrocketing divorce, real-life challenges. So armed with over 4 decades of heavyweight legal expertise from his time as a High Court judge and also as a leading barrister here in London, Sir Paul left the bench in 2014 to devote himself full-time to catalyzing positive change through Marriage Foundation's thought leadership. He frequently writes, speaks at prestigious academic, civic, and political institutions globally, and appears regularly across media to provide critical perspectives on strengthening families, communities, workplaces, and broader society by improving how we relate to one another as human beings. Fundamental as that. Sir Paul himself has been happily married for many decades, and we're delighted to have him as a true long-time supporter of the work that we do here. So it's such a pleasure and privilege to have you on the show with us.
Sir Paul,
it's a huge pleasure to be here. Huge pleasure.
There is so much that we would love to fit into this half-hour, 40-minute podcast, but can we start with a little bit of the background, the story behind what drives your passion now, and then we'll catch up with what it is that you're doing today.
Certainly. Well, let me start at the beginning and not take too long over this, but I qualified as a barrister in the dark ages in 1971. I drifted into family law. I went into a set of chambers that in those days did all forms of law, from the magistrate's court and traffic offences right the way through to crime and everything else. But gradually, over the first 10, 15 years, I became more and more specialised in the family law field because I found it extremely interesting, firstly, and also because it was the beginning of the great epidemic, which gradually gathered momentum during the end of the 70s and particularly into the 80s. I mean, when I started as a family law barrister, the family law work in the courts was regarded as the backwater. There was not much of it. It wasn't regarded as serious law. And we were, if you weren't doing heavy commercial disputes or top level crime, you were regarded as rather second rate. Well, within 10 years of my arrival, I hope the two things aren't connected, the divorce and family breakdown rates started really taking off. And it became clear that the biggest driver of this huge increase was not divorce, as is so often thought. That's the public perception that family breakdown is all about divorce. But it wasn't then, and it isn't now. The big driver of divorce is cohabitation and the lack of marriage. So it's not that marriages are breaking down particularly, it's just people aren't getting married. And during the 80s and 90s, the rate of cohabitation just went through the roof. I mean, if you look historically, from about 1600 onwards, and this is not research, as you might imagine, that I have done, but a very, very senior academic who worked for the Law Commission for a long time, spent 10 years going into the tracking very carefully the rate of cohabitation in the UK since about 1600. And you can do that now from your desk because all these records are online. Mm. And she's a very serious academic. And she concluded at the end of 10 years that the rate of cohabitation in the UK generally for the last 400 years had been around about 5%. So 5% of couples who were living together were not married, but the vast majority were. Mm. And this was completely not dependent on external circumstances. There is, if you look at the graphs, there's a slight change during big wars and epidemics and things like that. But on the whole, it was 5%, and it remained almost at that level until the 1960s. And it started creeping up after that. But then by the end of the 70s and into the 80s, it just took off. It absolutely took off. And the graph literally does that. I mean, it's amazing. It's an amazing piece of research. And it's gone on going up and up and up, although it has slowed down a bit, the rate of growth. So that what was 5% is now short of 55%. So 10-fold increase.
I was wondering where that number was going.
In the space of 50, 60 years. And this is, I mean, I can almost shut the podcast down because that is all in a sense, you need to know. That is the single biggest driver of all the stuff we talk about, is this massive increase. On the other side of the coin, although obviously as cohabitation has increased, the rate of marriage has come down, the rate of divorce has now been dropping for the last 20 odd years, 22 years, I think. It's been on a downward trajectory. And we're in fact now back to the rate of divorces, the rate of divorce that we had when I first started back in the 60s, which was perfectly manageable. It's perfectly manageable. But unfortunately, because everybody now, so few people get married, I mean, relatively speaking, there's still more people getting married, I should emphasize, than are cohabiting. But the numbers of people who cohabit now are what drives the family breakdown figures. People say it's 3 times, 4 times. We think it's about 4.5 times, 5 times greater, the rate of family breakdown amongst the cohabiting population than amongst the divorced population.
And that's such a powerful message story. I didn't realize that we could, that tracking it from the 1600s, it was just 5%, and now it's at 55%.
Well, we could spend the rest of the podcast discussing why it was, but I mean,
absolutely.
We can all have our theories, but obviously the arrival of the pill made a huge difference. And it was sort of chicken and egg. So as people began to live together, they had children together, and so the whole taboo of having children in an unmarried situation has just evaporated, as we all know now.
Completely.
Indeed, great many people have their children before they get married, then they get married. But just going back to the history, it was this explosion in the 80s that really started troubling me, because we couldn't cope in the family justice system. We couldn't cope with the numbers, and the numbers took off. And as I say, when I started in the early 70s, people coming through the family courts who were not married were vanishingly rare. I mean, the very odd case, you talk behind your hand, this couple isn't married. But it was really unusual. And we were still almost talking about bastards. And I mean, it was as old-fashioned as that. And then, as you probably won't remember, but then as the 70s went on, people began to live together unmarried, and people used to talk about living in sin, if you remember, and all that. And it just became gradually the norm. But it's not a healthy situation, because it's a fundamentally unstable arrangement. And if you feed children into this unstable arrangement,
Absolutely.
chances of it surviving obviously go down, because the strain on couples obviously with children is great.
So tell us a bit more about the instability. Why is cohabiting such a problem? Because, of course, there are different theories out there. People are reluctant to get married for various reasons. We're more financially independent, both men and women. And there are different thoughts out there on why marriage might have been oppressive and why cohabiting is a better way. So just help us understand what is causing the problem in cohabitation, and why the general trajectory will be in time for those relationships to break down. What's causing the instability?
Right. Well, I mean, fundamentally, the formation process is totally different. The formation of a cohabiting relationship is essentially informal, unthought out, and the American research calls it sliding. You slide into a cohabiting relationship. You don't make a decision. It sort of happens. In most cases, it involves people perhaps who've met at university, college. They've sort of had a relationship on and off. I'm taking a typical, probably rather middle class family. They drift into a relationship at university, college. When they leave, they decide they'll live together for a bit and see how it works. So they drift into that. Some of them then do get married. A lot of them don't. A lot of them then have children. And as I've already said, putting children into an unstable relationship is guaranteed almost to break it up, as we all know who've had children. And so it starts off with fundamentally a lack of proper thought and preparation. The fundamental difference between that and marriage is that you go through a process whereby the couple, both of them, decide they want to make this a lifelong arrangement. I mean, it comes under the general heading of commitment, but people bandy that word around without really knowing what they're talking about. What happens is that with a cohabiting couple is that you have, as our research director has called it, you have asymmetric commitment. That is to say, one of the couple is less committed than the other. Yeah. You drift into it. The less committed one, brackets, invariably the male, I have to say, close brackets, is going into it on the basis where it's okay for the moment. We'll see how it works out. The woman, on the other hand, probably is in her head more committed and has been for much longer than the man. So you have this asymmetric commitment with the female much more committed than the male. Typical case, not always, but that's the typical case.
Yes.
And the result is that the relationship is always slightly skewed, and the person with the least commitment, if you think about it, has the greatest control, because the one who's least committed is able to hold on to the more committed one because they are fearful of the arrangement coming to an end. So you get this unequal commitment. Now, in marriage, you get all that over with in what might be described as the engagement process. The couple decide somebody asks and someone accepts. It's like a contract. There's an offer and acceptance. So you have a clear thought process whereby both sides at the same time, in public, in front of friends and family, say, we want this to be a lifelong arrangement to the exclusion of all others, and we're determined to make it work. Now, that process, as far as we're concerned, is the key difference. And it's that leads to a far, far higher level of success than the cohabitants. And
this is really powerful because it's a real paradigm shift. The mindset is we're free. We have freedom to just kind of live together and see how it goes and do what we want to do. But the reality is you end up in a worse position than going through the intentional thought process of deciding and getting married and thinking through all the scenarios up front. That's a real paradigm shift of how we think about what is true freedom and where we've been getting it wrong.
Exactly. So you have the situation where you both start on the same page, looking in the same direction, having had the discussion, what Michaela Hyde, our executive director, always calls the forever discussion. You've had the discussion, you've made a decision between you, and you go forward on that basis. And there's no equivocation about what the underlying intention is. Of course, some cohabiting couples say they do have that, do that process. Do you know, I don't believe them. I don't believe them because I don't think the human wants to pin themselves down and tie themselves down to the future if they can avoid it. So they don't. And they just say, well, and men in particular say, well, what difference does it make? It's just a bit of paper. Why do we need it? And that's this familiar stuff. And you hear it from the highest in the land. I mean, I always was so shocked. I remember very well back in 2010 or wherever it was, when we had quite a high level of engagement with the Conservative government at that time. David Cameron in particular was a huge fan of marriage and was very vocal about it in those days. And Nick Clegg, the Liberal head of the Liberals in those days, was very public in saying, marriage doesn't add anything, it's just a piece of paper. Well, that was from a man who was happily married to and been happily married to a woman. And this is the terrible hypocrisy that goes on. I mean, if you look at the makeup of Parliament today, you'll find that the vast majority are married. Vast majority are married. And yet they will not commit themselves to saying it's a better arrangement.
That it makes a difference.
We'd all be so much better off if they would. So it was that explosion in the 80s and 90s which made me think, we can't go on like this. The courts can't cope with the avalanche of cases. In particular, they can't cope with the massive fallout to children because we were getting an explosion in care cases and almost all coming from unmarried couples, children who couldn't be looked after properly because the underlying the parental relationship was so unstable. And I began to think, well, isn't it time, those of us who see this on a daily basis, and after all, there are probably 1,000 family judges around the country, not all High Court judges, but a lot of the divorce work's done at a lower level than that. Isn't it time we had a serious discussion as the only people who really know what's going on behind the closed doors of the family courts, that we begin to speak out about what we're seeing. And so it was that which got me going and fun. And I mean, like all these things, you don't think them through very carefully. I was invited in 2008, I think, after I'd been appointed in 2000, I was invited to go and give the keynote speech at one of these legal conferences in the context of the collapsing legal aid system. They were the government was trying to save money, so they were withdrawing vast amounts of money, millions from the legal aid system, and saying people who go through family breakdown can't any longer have legal aid. We can't afford it because there are too many. There are just too many. There are just too many of these cases going through the courts. I mean, suddenly, having been, as I say, the sort of junior partner, we were we were taking up as much time as the criminal courts because, surprise, surprise, the sort of people who go through the criminal courts and the sort of people who go through messy divorces very often overlap. So we were up there with the criminal people and creating as much work. And so I went to give this talk about the iniquities of taking legal aid away from people at just in the time in their life when they needed help more than any other. So in order to set the scene, I did some serious research into the levels and the numbers involved, and I made a very hard-hitting speech about how the government could possibly contemplate doing this at a time when family breakdown was at these huge levels, and they needed to think very carefully about it. Well, the press picked it up. They weren't interested in the legal aid thing at all. They thought, well, it's just the lawyers bleating because they haven't got any money to pay for themselves. Yeah, exactly. But they were really, really taken with, High Court judge, family High Court judge talks about family breakdown and that we're in an epidemic. I mean, I still got the cuttings somewhere. And this went everywhere. I mean, it wasn't quite the days of things going viral, but it went everywhere. And I had correspondence from all over the world, literally. Australia, New Zealand, India, people all writing and saying, thank God somebody's talking about this. It's just as bad where we are. So on the back of this sort of nudge, I thought to myself, we need an organization that really, really focuses in on marriage, its important, why it works, why it's so good for families and all the rest of it. So we set it up in 2012. As you know, my co-partner, Harry Benson, who is probably the man in this country who knows more about the subject than anybody else, and I set it up. And it created quite a furore because a lot of people in the legal profession said, we can't have judges sounding off about social policy. I mean, where would this lead us? And I just used to get very irritated because I said, well, who else is going to? No one else sees it. No one else. I mean, there are social workers who see it a bit. There are solicitors who see it a bit. But if you're sitting in a family court day in and day out for weeks, months and years, and you see this stuff, you really begin to know what's going on. And the problems, as we know, are largely the same, present in slightly different ways, slightly more colourful, some than others. But fundamentally, the problems are the same. And as I say, what was striking was that suddenly the courts were full of unmarried people. We still had the divorces going through, all quite well managed. We had quite a good legal framework for people getting divorced. We had no legal framework for people who were cohabiting. The judges had to invent the financial arrangements for cohabiting couples because they didn't really exist. I mean, they sort of cobbled things together, and it's got no better. We don't have, as you know, a system of cohabitation law, and whether we should have one is another question altogether, but we don't have. So when you break up, quite apart from the fact you're more likely to break up, when you do break up, the system for sorting out the money is hideously complicated. Whereas divorce is a very well-trodden path. Of course, the arrangements for children don't alter. Children of the unmarried are dealt with in exactly the same way as the married, but there's just a lot more of them. So, I mean, that's where it all started. And then by 2014, I was getting so much kind of flack from people in the judiciary about talking out too often. They said, well, we don't mind you running the Marriage Foundation. That's fine. You can do that. But please, would you keep a low profile? So I said, no, that doesn't work, sadly. This is a high this is very much high profile. If it's not high
Needs to
profile,
be.
it's a waste of time.
Yeah.
And so, although they never asked, I mean, to be fair to them, they never said you've got to choose. I realized I had to choose, because otherwise every week I'd get the phone, the phone would ring, and some senior member of the judiciary would say, you can't, what you said over the weekend, you can't do that. So I realized we something had to give, and I knew it wouldn't be them. So I said, right, I'll go. So I left in 2014, which was 5 years before I would otherwise have gone.
Yeah.
But it was the best thing I did. Best thing I did.
Really?
I want to talk about that.
Because I could then say what I wanted, where I wanted, and not only that, but I could talk about the fact that I'd spent 30 years in this business, which shut everybody up, particularly the BBC. So you'd get invited on, and they'd more or less say, what do you know? And I'd say, how long have you got? And
because you've seen it. And it's so, what's so wonderful is that you saw it day in, day out, and rather than be paid to deal with it, you were bothered enough to care, to want to make a difference, to stop this tide of broken relationships coming through.
I want to come back to actually the work that you've done since the conversation we were just having just now. But actually, before we get to that, I want to back up just a little bit and actually talk about the reasons why you think this epidemic has happened. Is it, I'm going to be provocative here, but is it because people just want to have their cake and eat it? They want the stability, they want the family life, etc., but they want to reserve the right that another bus might come along that looks slightly better, or I'm going to be attracted to that one. Why are they not committing? I think the research that Harry has done is very categorical of the benefits of getting married, of having stable relationships, etc. Why are people not choosing that? Why are they still wanting to not go that route?
Well, John, I mean, I think one must get fairly earthy here. I mean, if you go back to the so-called swinging 60s, the idea of having a full-blown relationship with your girlfriend was only just beginning to take off. And of course, it coincided with the arrival of the pill. People commit, men in particular are driven to commit, I'm afraid, by the old-fashioned sexual instincts which drive people in their teenage years, particularly men. And you can see that even nowadays, because if you go into the evangelical Christian community, people still get married in their early 20s because the men want to get on with it.
Yep.
They want to get on with it. They want the whole cake, as you rightly say.
Yep.
If you're going to get the cake without the need to get married, then most men will buy that one pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. And I'm afraid to say I am absolutely sure of this, and Harry agrees with me, this was the great unhinging, if you like, because if you can have a full-blown relationship, then by moving in with your girlfriend, then you won't risk making it a permanent arrangement. Yeah. So this is what happened. I mean, this is what happened in the 70s and 80s. And of course, with the arrival of that, as I say, we had this chicken and egg situation. No one had children who weren't married. And then they were living together, and people realized that they were having a sexual relationship, obviously, but they weren't getting pregnant because of the pill. So when people increasingly started having children unmarried, it was only a short step before people just said, well, everybody's doing it now. So it just snowballed, and it snowballed in such a short time. I mean, literally, as I've said, the graph literally does that. Goes in a straight line up through the roof in the 80s, and it's stayed up there ever since and carried on growing. And but it's driven by those fairly old-fashioned human instincts, and so we now have a situation where, as I say, 20% of couples in this country with children are at least 20% are unmarried. I'm happy to say that marriage is still winning quite heavily, but but it's nothing to what it once was. Nothing to what it once was. And now
So
we
even
have a situation where, as you rightly say, what is it that's stopping people get married? Well, the answer, there's lots and lots of reasons for that, but I think it's a feeling that we can't afford it. We don't need to. We'll give it a try. We'll try without, and it's now become, as you know, the norm. The norm in the non-Christian part of, I say Christian, non-religious, because I think the Muslims are the same. That people do have a kind of trial period. They think, well, we'll see how this works, and then if it does work, and we want to have children, we'll get married. And certainly, in the better off section of the community, that is roughly speaking what happens. They live together in a flat, and then the woman very sensibly says, look, if you want to take this any further, if you want to start having a family, I want to do this properly. And they're the people who drive. I think they're the people who drive the marriages.
Marriage.
I like the word you used, that you said Harry used about unhinging, because I think what's important about this conversation is to say we're not making a religious kind of judgment on people, whether they're married or not. We're saying that marriage, the decision process you have to go through to make a publicly binding commitment of marriage serves you in the long run with the commitment that you with the decisions and the thinking and the intentionality that goes into it. The institution of marriage creates the stability that you need in relationships for when the trying times come, especially with children. That's the clear unhinging of religious judgment versus the institution of marriage.
Absolutely.
That works. Yeah.
You don't get anywhere talking to people about, well, this is what the Bible says. I mean, you might get somewhere with people who already believe in the institution of marriage. They would say here, but to the vast majority of people, running this argument on a biblical or religious basis cuts no ice whatever. The only thing that cuts through with people is when you start telling them the impact on the stability of their relationship, and in particular the impact of the impact of instability on their children. That does.
Can we just talk about that for a minute? Can we talk about the impact of instability in a relationship on the children?
Yes, I mean the most important factor in a child's development, by a country mile compared with other considerations, is the stable brackets, preferably happy, but stable. I don't like to get into happy because it's, what does it mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Is the stable relationship of the parents. That's the key to children's flourishing. And we all know that. I mean, you talk to school teachers, you talk to whatever. That is the absolute key. And if children come from a stable background, everything else is secondary. I mean, if they go to good schools, that's helpful. If dad's got a good job, that's helpful. All these things help. But the key is what is going on with the parents. If you have a stable relationship of the parents, on the whole, the children do okay and flourish. If you have instability, and you will know this, depending on the form it takes, it's the prime driver of all the social ills that we know about. Gang crime, knife crime, drugs, all the stuff that we hear about all day long, all week long, all year long. Track back, it's nearly always underlying that is a dysfunctional family, or a family without a father. It's that lack of core stability in the family, that undermines everything. And the statistics, are there for all to see. I mean, it's if you look at the if you look at the figures for 15-year-olds, the standout statistic is the fact that by the age of 15, 60% of children are no longer living with their birth parents. Okay, so you've already got this huge fall off, but you're 4 times more likely to be living with your parents during the time when you're taking your GCSEs, if you like, which is that's sort of key benchmark time. If your parents are married, it's as simple as that. It's 3 to 4 times greater prospect of you being with your parents in those critical years. And I mean, I used to see it in the courts, the effect on children of warring parents. And I mean, not all divorces, of course, are colourful and very aggressive. A lot of divorces is so-called civilized. But the fact is that the breakup of the parental relationship during the children's teenage years is highly, highly damaging, and no one likes to admit it, but that's the fact. Yeah. And no one, least of all the government and people who ought to be talking about it, will face up to it, talk about it, and advocate processes to deal with the problem. I mean, and the other big finding that we have really exposed in the last 5 years is what we call the marriage gap, which is that amongst what might be described as the top end earners, and we're not talking about people earning a fortune, we're talking about people on 50, 60, 70,000 a year, the rate of marriage has remained more or less the same forever. So, I mean, if you look at members of parliament and all that crew, the rate of marriage, they may not get married from a state of complete singleness, but they get married before they have their children, or at the time that they have their children. And if you're in that upper income cohort, 80% chance you'll get married at some point, particularly if you have children. As you go down the income scale, it falls away sharply. And by the time you get to people who are on 20,000 a year or less, people on benefits, the rate is way, way down below 20% now. And so that section of our community, who are having the biggest struggle anyway because of the shortage of funds, all the problems that address so often that particular section of the community, also, and I think most significantly, have unstable families. So their children are least likely to be enjoying the benefits of a stable relationship of the parents.
A stable relationship. We certainly saw a lot of that while our children are off at university, one's finished now, but certainly our daughter, when she was at university, the report back was that I think at one point there were 12 of them in a flat, and I think she was the only one who still had parents who were married or were together. And so the numbers are certainly reflecting that. And I think where we come in the work we do, because the pushback we get is people would say, well, if the couple are unhappy, do you want them should they just stay together and live a miserable life? Why would you say that? And of course, the work that we then do says, no, don't do that.
Right.
But get some education, get some input that will help you have a better relationship. Because we know it's made a difference in our relationship. Do that.
So we're talking about absolutely having better skills to do relationships well, but the importance of that commitment up front, that public commitment, the institution of marriage is making a difference. That's what I'm getting from the conversation, that the research isn't lying. The statistics is painting a very clear story that decision to do life together and create the environment for raising a family makes a difference to the stability of the parents and therefore to the well-being of children. So,
Yeah.
Paul, there is so much that we could dive into, but we're aware of time. If
But I
you
mean,
could
it's
wave,
about creating. I always say it's very simple. Marriage changes the psychology of the
right?
relation. The couple cease to be two individuals who are ploughing their individual furrows. They become, using the vernacular, an item. They become one
Yeah,
in
yeah,
all the biblical sense, but they do become one. And
yeah,
when you have made that public commitment and signed the documents and done all the things, whether you do it religiously or not, it's neither here nor there. On the whole, people want to make a success of it. It's like the
Yeah.
difference between an oral contract and a written contract. You know, when it's in writing
yeah,
in front of you, you are staking your reputation almost on it working. And that's
yeah,
completely mind altering, particularly for men. Because once they have made the commitment, funnily enough, it's the men probably who stick at it more than the women. Because they're
wow,
much slower to get involved, much slower to make the commitment.
Yeah.
When they do, they're much
They,
less likely to file for divorce, much less likely. And of course, we now have the situation, I mean, it's quite a healthy situation, that people don't get married as I did in my early 20s. I mean, to say I was a child would be an exaggeration. I was hardly had a diaper, as they say. But I mean, I got married very, very young at the age of 23. Nowadays, the average age for women is 33, and for men it's about 35, 36, and it's creeping up all the time. And you might say, well, is that a healthy situation? Well, all I can say is that people who get married that much later have a very low divorce rate. Very, very low divorce rate. The divorce rate, as I say, has been falling. People still, you made the mistake this morning, funnily enough, John, when you said, well, and of course we all know what the problem is, divorce has been going through the roof. No, divorce has been going through the floor. It's been going
right,
down.
Yeah.
Family breakdowns going up. And that
yeah.
is, I'll send you some of these graphs, but it's
Please.
literally a crossover. And that's where we have the problems. That's where we have the problems. People who make their commitments later on in life really are doing it well.
Yeah, because I guess by then they're really deciding.
Quite.
If you had a magic wand, that's where I want to end this. If you had a magic wand, what would you do to change the trajectory that we're on as a
And
society?
the impact that it's having, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I would want completely unequivocal statements from those who govern us about the importance, significance of marriage. I would like very clear encouragement of people to get married with proper, valuable incentives. And we know it works because one country has tried it, and that's Hungary. Mr. Orban, who is not everybody's favorite, and I totally get that, realized quite early on that he had a major family breakdown problem in Hungary. And they simply said, right, we are going to incentivize people to get married. So they laid on big marriage allowances. They gave the couples cheap loans to buy housing and other financial incentives. They went from being at the bottom of the European League to the top. Okay, so
wow.
absolutely changed. Not only that, but as you will know well, the biggest problem in Europe now is falling birth rates. And there aren't going to be many of us left. The rate is falling, and this is universal across the globe, as you know. Sorry, I've just got cramp in my leg. But I mean, it's a problem across the Western world. The only country that's bucking the trend is Hungary. Hungary's demographic doesn't have this problem at all because people are still basically doing what we always have done in the past. And of course, there was a time in this country when there was a serious marriage allowance, which was worth, I mean, when I got married, I think the marriage allowance was £1,500. Well, I mean, add on inflation from that, we'd be talking at least 10,000, probably more. And that emanates from a belief that it's good for society, and we need to support it and encourage people and help them stay together and all the rest of it. So, if you ask me what would I do, I would like a cabinet level minister in charge of family, marriage and families to shout this stuff from the rooftops.
On the roof. Yeah.
On a daily basis, supported by all the numbers, of which there is a ton of statistical information now, and back it with some serious policies. I mean, the Conservative Party, after I don't know how many years, finally got round to producing a transferable tax allowance of £220. Well, I mean, honestly, you might as well give someone a packet of fags. It's a complete waste of money. Indeed, it's worse. I think it's almost insulting to say, well, shut those people up who never stop going on about this. We'll bung a few quid at it. It doesn't have any effect on anything at all.
Yeah.
But that's what's needed. At a macro level, that's what's needed.
Yeah. And let's hope the new government will do something different. I mean, because we're right alongside you, waving our wand, saying absolutely have the government is supporting and showing the benefits of marriage, and we're saying wave that other one right alongside it, saying here are the skills to make sure that those marriages and those relationships are successful. Because if those relationships are strained or challenged or
in conflict,
just unpleasant, then people are not going to want to stick around with them. So we're saying give people the skills as a natural course of their daily lives. Just give them those skills to get on with the people around them to make the whole thing a success.
So
and as you say, as we've got experience, as Harry, our research chap, has as well, and you have, of having been to the brink, it is not irremediable. It really is not irremediable.
Exactly.
I mean, my wife and I, we went through a difficult patch. We went and saw an extremely skillful person, and only a few sessions totally changed our whole perspective on our relationship, and we've benefited from it ever since. I mean, there's no question about it. Every single marriage has tricky times. Of course it does. Of course it does, and we need to know how to navigate them. And I mean, one of the extraordinary bits of research is that you always hear. Well, you always have the response that you've just talked about. Why you can't stay together in an unhappy marriage, and if it's unhappy, the best thing to do is to call it a day and go and start all over again. Definitely not the right answer.
Absolutely.
One of our opening mottos was "Mend it, don't end it," and it is the truth that if you go through a careful mending process, you end up with a far, far better, more and high quality relationship. And the statistics show that if you ask people who are going through divorce whether they were happy 12 months earlier, the vast majority were. So this is not a sort of avalanche of people beating each other up and terribly violent, abusive relationships. It's nothing to do with that. They just fizzle out. That's the biggest cause of family breakdown, is not physical abuse, sexual abuse, all that stuff. They're the high profile ones. They're the ones who get onto the front page of the tabloids. But they're not the majority. The majority are people who just get bored, find someone else because they're just a bit bored, and they say, well, we're going to do this in a very civilized way, believing that if they do it in a civilized way, their families won't be affected and the children won't be affected. Unfortunately for them, once again, with so much of this stuff, it's counterintuitive. The children who suffer most are the ones who go through so-called tidy, civilized divorces, because they don't get it. They don't understand why is mum and dad, who are behaving perfectly well towards each other, why are they packing it up? Why can't they make this work? And if they can't make it work and it looks okay to us, how are we going to make it work? So again,
and that's the thing.
The American research shows quite clearly that people who have so-called stress-free divorces end up with children who are every bit as screwed up as the ones
That's screwed up, messed up.
who have to deal with the plates flying.
Yeah,
Because if the plates are flying, and I was brought up in a family where there was a lot of plate flying going on, and shouting and alcohol and things like that, you could see that this was a tricky. Both sides were having a tricky time, and I think my mother used to storm out of the house, slam the door, and saying, "I'm never come back at least once a month." You know, yawn. She was off. My dad. And my father's response very often after they'd had a blazing row was to leave the house and say, "I'm off," and he'd go and sleep in the car outside. And in those days, they had a car which had a kind of plastic cover, which is what people had in those days. And he'd crawl in the plastic cover and spend the night there. And in the morning, you watch, and as he'd come out like a sort of slug coming out from underneath this thing, and it would all blow over, and on we'd go. But as a child, you could see there were problems. Actually, they then did go and get some help, and it was all sorted out. And towards the end of their lives, they had a very, very fulfilling time. But as children, you can understand it. You can't understand it when you're sat down by your two parents, and they say, "Well, we love you very much, but Mummy and Daddy can't make it work, so we're going to separate and get divorced, and you won't be affected." That does their head in.
I think we should end it just because of time, but there is so much more that we want to unpack. I think we're going to love to have you come back again another time. But there's so many other topics we want to touch on. We want to talk about the work.
I'm very happy because I'd be very, very happy for you to put this stuff out. So, I mean, we can talk more about some of the statistics next time, if you like.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
I'm sure there are lots of nuggets you have to share, but I think Men That Don't End It is a...
I was going to say there are three things that I want to take away from today. The first is marriage changes the psychology, and it absolutely does. It changes the way you approach life together and really want to work at it as one. Mend it, don't end it. And know that marriages, relationships will go through tough patches. So get the help, get the skills, and get the support you need to mend it rather than end it. And just know that conflict creates chaos for children. The impact of instability on the next generation is where the problem really sits, and that's the bit we need to fix. So really powerful messages at a macro level. What I loved is the statistics and the graphs and the trajectory that show this isn't about a religious judgment or a preference for the institution of marriage. It's showing that if you want stability in society, healthy children, healthy next generation, we need to have a serious commitment to making marriages work, helping people get married and stay married.
Yeah. And just one last statistic, and I'll send you all our statistics so that you can have a chat. We'll have another meeting. But one that always sticks with me is, and this hasn't changed because we've done it 2 or 3 times. If you go in and ask teenagers between the ages of 18 and 22, I think, whether they want to get married, 80% of them say they do. 80% of them want what they have a picture of a good marriage. It's usually nowadays, unfortunately, not the parents but the grandparents, and they want a bit of that, please. They don't know how to get it. They don't understand that marriage is key, and that is where some help is definitely needed, because the desire to get married is as deeply embedded in us, because we all want what Harry calls long-term reliable love, and the only place you find it is in a relationship where everybody knows what's going on.
Wow.
Yeah.
More models of great marriages working, and more encouragement in terms of skills and support to help people get there. Wonderful.
And the least well off are the biggest sufferers.
Yeah, greatest room for impact.
Tragic. And the government, we haven't even got onto this problem of the government's social security regime, the universal credit regime, which actually encourages and or positively supports people to stay separate, because the financial incentives of getting together are such that if you're on that sort of level of Social Security, you lose thousands and thousands of pounds. Well, that's...
Hopefully, I was going to say, hopefully by the time we have you back, we'll have more clarity from our new government, certainly here in the UK, as to what they want to do, if anything,
what
about that. Hopefully something to improve.
I mean, it's a difficult problem, because I can see that when two people move together, it's rational to say they don't need so much money. They're not, they only need one house, one bar of soap. But it has the impact that people don't make a commitment to each other, don't move in, or at the very least, and there's plenty of evidence of this, they pretend they're not living together, so they continue to get two separate lots of state benefit, whereas in fact they are really living together. It's a difficult one. I mean, I've always acknowledged that it's a difficult one, but it has huge sociological effect. I mean, if you encourage people if you incentivize people to stay separate, then at that level, it makes all the difference in the world to your economy. I mean, it's pretty basic, really. It's not a few hundred quid; it's many thousands.
Yeah. I was going to say, you've given our listeners so much to think about today.
And a taster for the next one, I think, for what we'll discuss next.
Number one. Number two, we'll do. Let me send you all the stuff, and you can look at it and see what you want to ask me about.
But if people want to find out about the Marriage Foundation, what's the website that they can go to?
Well, I ought to know it, oughtn't I? It's marriagefoundation.org. I'll give it to you.
We'll put it in the show notes as well.
It's marriagefoundation.org.uk. There's a big website. All our research is on there. All the statistics, all the press releases, everything. It's all there.
Yeah. Amazing.
Wonderful.
So, Paul, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation. You're doing amazing work, and we just wish you every success in getting this strong message out there to make a difference in the direction that the nation goes in. Not just our nation, but nations around the world.
Well, marriage, it changes the psychology, and we've all known that, but we've sort of forgotten it.
Looking forward to round two. So to our audience around the world, we say, well, firstly, thank you to Sir Paul, but to our audience, thanks for being with us. And looking forward to seeing you again next time.
Bye-bye.
A real pleasure. See you soon.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. And if you did, and you want to hear more, the best thing to do is subscribe. Then you'll never miss an episode. There's a new one every Friday. You can stay connected with us on social media at The 4 Habits for updates, behind-the-scenes content, and to participate in discussions related to the show. We always love to hear from you. And of course, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review on your preferred platform to allow us to reach more listeners and help people around the globe radically transform the way they do relationships, so they too can enjoy better harmony at home, thrive at work, and win at life.